Pretty zen. It's blue. I clicked it. Give me 5 seconds. Oh, and we're live. It's Wednesday, July 7th, 5:10 p.m. Eastern Time. It is the first time Ben and I have been together in way more than 465 days, but at least 465 days. And we're in Brooklyn at 4th Avenue Pub. And yeah,
I could have just come there with you.
Where are you?
Well, I'm in Manhattan.
Yeah.
We could have let me know.
Well, right. That's like a lifetime away. So, we are not allowed to have fun anymore, but except we obviously kind of are, but shh. And we are allowed to have Wilfred Codrington, professor of law at Brooklyn Law School, constitutional law scholar, voting rights scholar, election law scholar. You have a book coming out soon, but I wanted to bring you on to talk about all of the voting rights stuff that came out of the Supreme Court last week, and you were like, no, I don't want to talk about it. I'm sick of talking about it. It's so sad. So how about ranked choice voting? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think just quickly, and I'm sure there's other things to discuss, but I'm really frustrated how it played out, particularly with the sample ballots that were left in the machines. And I think that sort of mishap has really cast a shadow over everything that could be good and well going on with ranked choice voting, which is a great innovation, right? The idea behind ranked choice voting is that we're choosing people in the order we'd like to see them. So the person who is preferred most by most people will become the person to represent us. That still seems to be happening. It seems that it's going to be Eric Adams. I can't say that that was my choice, but that's separate and apart from the debacle that has occurred at the Board of Elections, right? Like, we hear issues about the New York City Board of Elections every election or two. Something happens, people are thrown off the voting rolls mistakenly, and this just happens to be the latest incident, right? But I don't think we should confuse ranked choice voting with New York City incompetency.
Do you remember when didn't they have an issue? Didn't they just recently also have an issue with the presidential election with the absentee ballot printing? Yeah, yes, right? Yes. Okay.
And we just recently got early voting, and there's just so many things at New York, particularly as a progressive state, I think, but in general, as a state that likes to hold it out as being pro-democracy, should have better, whether it's in the administration of elections as we sort of go through them, or in terms of innovations to make ballot access and access to voting a lot easier. And so, if you read some of the news, you hear about some of the nepotism going on there, right? I'm sure that doesn't help, right? Ballot sort of election laws and anti-corruption or pro-integrity laws kind of go hand in hand. So it doesn't surprise me when you hear that there's lots of nepotism going on in an organization, and then that organization is also failing time and time again. But ranked choice voting is occurring all over the country. It was supposed to be a big rollout on the sort of large stage, and it's unfortunate that it happened like that. But I think the results will stand, and we'll have another one to tell the story, hopefully a better story next time.
New York on this, because this has been a bugaboo of mine for a while. And, during the 2020 election, we saw the southern wingnut states, whether it was Texas or Georgia or Florida, just radically outperforming New York and Connecticut in early voting, in getting that percentage of people who had voted prior to election day way higher. And the supposedly progressive states, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, really underperforming. And I railed on this show a few times that, hey, if New York had a Republican governor and a conservative legislature, we would be calling this voter suppression, and we'd be really upset about it. And somehow, because it's not done maliciously with respect to voting rights, it's done negligently because of incompetence, we kind of give it a pass. But we should actually treat it exactly the same way as if, Governor Kemp were doing it intentionally in Georgia. It's a systemic set of barriers that make voting more difficult rather than easier. And some percentage of the electorate, though the turnout in the mayor's race was quite high, it was lower than it would have been if if certain things had been different. And certainly in 2020, it was harder to vote in New York than it was to vote in Georgia or Texas or these states that we actually come down really hard on, and rightly so in my view, in their voter suppression. So my question is, should we call New York's lackadaisical attitude toward, voting access, should we just call it voter suppression and treat it exactly like it was it was one of the bad states?
So I think it would. So I empathize with everything you said. I would hesitate to call it voter suppression and treat it as voter suppression, because that is a remedy for something very specific. Now, that's not to say that there are not things that are comparable about them, right? Whether you are bad in administration or you're bad because you want to suppress people, either way, you're not allowing the bulk of or everyone who should and wants to vote, right? That's the problem one way or the other. I think that they would have different solutions, right? So one of the reasons I think why it became easier to vote in a place like Florida, and I'm not sure about the metrics exactly, but let's just take that for granted, is because all eyes were on Florida, right? So, and same thing with Georgia. Like Stacey Abrams had a big effort out there to make sure that people got to vote, knowing that there were going to be these obstacles. In a place like New York, where we put much of the focus on the presidency, people are sort of taking it for granted that it was going to go for the Democrat no matter what, and everything else is sort of subsidiary. That's not how I think about democracy. I think every office, every elected office matters. Every appointed office matters, right? So I think some of the problems we have with New York have other solutions. So we have very much like a party boss system. I don't like that, right? Like this is the whole nepotism thing. And I think that if things were more competitive there, sort of in those, we'd have people breaking through. But then like when people break through a system and they sort of frustrate the existing sort of structure, there's other issues you have too. I'd rather be dealing with those, but I don't think we deal with them in the same way. But I do think we need to be dealing with them entirely. It's not a surprise that part of New York was actually covered under the Voting Rights Act. We're going to get to the Voting Rights Act pretty soon. But, because New York actually has problems, right? Like, I don't think we can disclaim that. I do think that we have to call it for what it is. And and I believe, I want to say part of Manhattan too. I think the county of New York was also in it. But we don't have that part of the Voting Rights Act anymore. So,
Yeah. Just a question. So would you consider them both issues of bad faith in that regard?
Yes.
And kind of just in terms of a solution, is it more of a solution that would be equity versus equality? Because you've touched on this a bit in your writing.
Yeah, so the equity part, I think, is comes up in New York, certainly, because I don't think everyone has sort of a stake in what's going on, right? And I think that's for various reasons. People don't feel like they have a stake because they feel like New York is less important in general. People don't feel like they have a stake because they feel like the party bosses are running the stuff. The equality aspect, I think that's sort of cross-jurisdictional, right? Like, so should my vote and my ability to vote be equal irrespective of where I am? And I think that sort of crosses the line. In terms of how it plays out throughout the South and the various jurisdictions, where I think I want to say sort of best case scenario, what they're trying to do is suppress votes because of party, but how it plays itself out because of the interrelation between other factors, most notably race, is that you are basically furthering suppression of a sort of marginalized community that has been that has not had traditional access to voting and traditionally, right? So yeah, I would say that there's bad faith in both, but for different reasons. And then there's other things in both that are different from each other. Yeah, but we need some reforms in New York. We definitely need reforms in New York. But I want to talk about the other reforms. Like there are reforms all over the country that we need to be dealing with right now, right? So as I speak, we're in July. The Brennan Center, I will honestly admit my affiliation with the organization. I am a fellow there, but they put out research that we're like since May, there have been upwards of 200 restricted voting measures introduced across the countries, right? And you know, we can put that in the equity bucket. We can put that in the equality bucket. But either way, what I'm going to say is that's in the suppressive bucket. We're talking about measures that give you less time to register. We're talking about measures that implement restrictive voting ID requirements. We're talking about measures that are now restricting the availability of mail drop boxes for absentee ballots, something that became so vital during the pandemic, right? Like, where would we have been if that wasn't available, especially in larger counties and places where you could just sort of, you drive. So we're talking about measures right now that are really restricting people from giving out water and food to people who are standing in line to vote. And we know that the people who are standing in line to vote, again, another report by the organization, the Brennan Center, 45, 55 minutes, Latino and Black voters are waiting in line longer than white voters, right? So who is it impacting really when we're saying that you're unable to give out water to people standing in the heat waiting to vote or whatever the conditions are? I don't want to make this a New York versus Florida thing. I want to make this a national thing. And I know Kate said we'll talk about anything but the voting rights case, but we can also talk about the voting rights case because that touches on the whole sort of national issue we're facing right now.
All right. So let's start with the voting rights case. Since you don't want to talk about it, let's get it out of the way. We'll deal with it and we'll be done. For those who want Will's extended thoughts on the voting rights case, he was on strict scrutiny last week. A discussion with women on it and why they are both super depressed and kind of angry at Sam Alito. But for those who are not going to go listen to strict scrutiny, give us the 60-second version. What did Alito do, or Alito and the 5 others, and why does it bother you that much?
Sure. I might have to take 120 seconds.
You know, I'm just trying to respect your desire not to talk about this.
I want to say something
as long as you want.
I am happy to talk about this case. What I told Kate was I didn't want to talk about the disclosure case because that one makes me even more irate because people are trying to separate them from the campaign finance laws when they're obviously going to merge into the same thing. That one frustrates me because people are acting like it's not a thing. At least people are showing the outrage that is due for the Brnovich case. So Brnovich case is the voting rights case. We're dealing with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and it dealt with 2 specific policies that the state of Arizona had in place regarding its elections. So the first policy was the out of precinct policy. There's a provision of the law that renders invalid any votes that were cast in the wrong precinct. Right? You know, precincts are interesting because, you know, we might go to the same building and there could be like 4 different precincts in the same building. Like table 1 could be my precinct and table 2 might not be. But if I cast my vote at table 2, then my vote won't count. That's what the out of precinct policy says. And what we know about the out of precinct policy is that it impacts minorities more than white people. So twice as likely to have your vote discarded if you are either or Native American, Black American, Latino than you are a white person, right? It's not the most used method of voting.
You don't accept Alito's assurance that because those are co-variables with poverty and other things that makes it okay.
So it makes
he promised me that I shouldn't worry about it because it could be an overdetermined variable because the Black and Native peoples who are much twice as likely to have their votes discarded are also likelier to be poor. And it could be a reflection of the poverty.
Unemployed and lower education. So it might all be that. But if you want to, but all that's probably connected to race, which is one problem. But the other problem is he gets, and this is what Leah Littman said, which is great. He gets so close to saying like structural racism, but then walks back and be like, oh, well, whatever.
I actually want to pause over this because I do think it is normally the conservative position is to deny the existence of structural racism.
Right.
Here, I don't think it is an ungenerous reading to say that he's saying, hey, there's structural racism and that's a defense, right? It's not intentional, it's merely structural, and therefore we should be complacent about it. Am I being ungenerous to him in that reading?
So I don't think I'm not sure that he's saying it is a defense. Maybe he's saying it's a mitigating factor, right? The fact that you are poor or you're less likely to have a stable job or a job that allows you to take off the vote or something, that is part of the reason that he's saying that you vote less or you're less likely to understand the instructions. And so your vote might be discarded more or what have you. The problem is, the problem is that when lawmakers amended the Voting Rights Act in 1982, what they said is you need to take into account the totality of circumstances. And if, in light of the totality of circumstances, people of color are not given equal opportunity to have their votes counted, then we have a problem. Right? So he's admitting that we're looking at the totality of circumstances, these socioeconomic factors, these historical factors, what have you.
But isn't that like basically disparate impact? Isn't that, or no? Are those separate?
So,
do you put those
no,
you're
so it's he wants disparate impact to be a part of the whole analysis. I think lawmakers and courts before this wanted disparate impact to be a bigger part of the analysis. He wants to shrink it. So he wants to take into account these other factors. This is going to send me on another tirade, so you're going to have to interrupt me at some point. But the other factors that he wants it to be us to take into account are totally untethered from the text itself. So we had start this opinion with this whole textual discussion. What does it mean for something to be open? What does it mean to have an equal opportunity? Sort of like defines this in the dictionary and stuff like that. And then that's the last of that. Then he starts going on making up some factors that are totally not in the Senate report, not in the text, not in the dictionary. So it's just like, what gives, buddy? Are you a textualist or are you not a textualist? I think Justice Kagan dings him for that at various points in her dissent, especially in the footnotes. Read the footnotes. Footnotes are funny. She
also quoted Scalia several times.
Yes. So we start there, right? So but one of the things that we're supposed to be, sorry to get back to your point, Ben, one of the things we're supposed to be considering is all of these sociological and socioeconomic circumstances, and considering in light of those, does the policy make it harder for people of color to vote? And if it does, then we have a problem. But Justice Alito seems to say, if we do, then we have a culprit that we can't really address.
So can I ask you a little bit to tie the two parts of our conversation together, two parts so far? Can I ask you a little bit about the sort of one-way ratchet component of how these cases get analyzed? So if you're in New York and you don't bother to have progressive voter access stuff at all, and you don't bother much with the early voting stuff, you basically don't have a problem under the Voting Rights Act, at least under Section 2.
I don't think that's true.
But if you're Arizona,
I don't think that's true.
And you do it, then and you do stuff and then you alter it, you restrain it, you take it away, then you become subject to a disparate impact or to a voter suppression analysis, which seems to me to be perfectly fine. I actually don't have a problem with that, except that I think that New York should have a problem too. And what Alito seems to be saying is neither of them should have a problem unless all these conditions that Congress actually didn't write into the statute are met. And I think actually, I look at it and I say, look, maybe it's enough that New York should be embarrassed by the fact that Georgia kicked its ass in voter access in 2020. But I think it's weird as hell that is not, like, New York has less of a problem than Georgia right now because, well, Georgia has less of a problem than it did last week, but Georgia has a problem because it gave and then took away selectively, whereas New York never gave in the first place, so it doesn't have a problem. And that seems to me to be a sort of fucked up incentive structure. It's basically like, don't go there, because then if you ever retreat a little bit, you have a Voting Rights Act problem.
Right. So I don't think that's really the case, that New York doesn't have a problem. It's that people don't, they're not the resources or times or sort of triaging to call out New York's problem, right? And this is, I think, a problem of like whose motives, right? Democrats are motivated by getting more people to vote, and Republicans seem to want less people to vote because that's how, like, you win, right? I can, some people might quibble with some of those things, that statement on the margins, but that tends to be what's the case, right? So if Democrats are feeling pretty like good about New York, they're not going to waste their resources on litigating New York cases. There have been New York cases that people litigate all the time, but we hear about the ones in these other states that are either swing states or states that are so egregious in other places that have had a long history of doing this. And there's nobody to, and Republicans are sort of like happy to defend those cases. But if you could have Republicans actually bringing cases about New York saying that there's not enough access, I would be perfectly fine with that. Again, I like you, I think it's all pretty fucked up across the board. But we have to think about how our system works and where it incentivizes us to bring suit, right?
Almost like Congress should pass national standards or something.
That might be a federal takeover over state's province, and we damn sure can't have that.
Can't win.
That's not, the federal takeover thing, that was a big a theme of Justice Alito, and there are two parts of it that sort of bugged me about this. I mean, one part of it is Congress has peremptory power over federal elections, at least, right? Like if Congress wanted to, it could write a complete election code to govern federal elections, and it hasn't, right? And obviously, these cases we're dealing with, there's overlap because some of these cases, they're electing both national and state figures on these ballots. That's not happening, right? We know HR 1 has been stalled, and even HR 4, which is supposed to sort of revitalize the Voting Rights Act, it doesn't look like there's going to be the votes for that, what have you. So there's that problem already. But then the Voting Rights Act was a measure to actually federalize elections more, right? And we did that with Section 5, which federalized it by putting oversight over jurisdictions that had historical discrimination. We did it by Section 2, which has nationwide coverage. So there are elements of, we don't have a completely federalized system, but certainly that was part of what the Voting Rights Act was to accomplish. And here in this opinion, Justice Alito keeps saying that like this is a sort of radical project, and what we're trying to do is to federalize these elections. This sort of federal takeover elections is that sort of stalking horse, or that Trojan horse for him that sort of serves as the backdrop of the entire opinion, when that's not really what's happening. Or it's happening at least to the extent that like lawmakers contemplated it.
One of the other things that I thought was notable is that they just declined to make a rule. So it becomes even more ambiguous about what the inequities would have to be suffered in order for harm to be acknowledged by the court. And so I don't know if you want to respond to that, but that drove me crazy because you don't even give a functioning test. Like, what are we dealing with?
Right. So, the part of the reason why, and the big reason why this case came is, again, I don't want to beat Section 5 and Shelby with a dead horse, but Section 5 was really about vote denial cases. So cases where we're dealing with obstructions to the ability to register, to cast your vote, or to have your vote counted. Section 2 was written and amended, and all the doctrine that's most of the doctrine just come out dealt with vote dilution. So what we're dealing with really is redistricting and other things where geography impacts how we're voting and how we're represented, right? So we're dealing with those two separate things. Once Shelby was gone, we had no more Section 5 that was functioning. So what advocates started to do is they looked to Section 2 to fulfill that void. You know, the Supreme Court also said when it eviscerated Section 5 that you still have a functioning Section 2, so you can still do this, right? So now this is the first.
Anymore.
I know. So this is the first Section 2 vote denial case that the Supreme Court's dealing with, and it creates what you say is a non-rule, right? Like this is, but it is weird because it is this rule. So what's going to happen now is like the Supreme Court set out this sort of guideposts, which is not supposed to be completely comprehensive, but we're supposed to consider these things. There's no way that you're going to get to lower courts trying to figure out what this ruling means, not appealing to those separate factors to sort of apply the test. So it is obviously, or at least if you stick out 5 things and say there's these other things too, like those first 5 things are going to be where people are going to put all their buckets because they're the only thing that they really, I mean, they're going to put their eggs all in that bucket because they're the only things that have been sort of laid out, right? Like these are the guideposts. So it really is a test, even if they don't want to call it a test. I guarantee you that all of the Section 2 vote denial claims we see from here on out will focus on those 5 factors, right? And the problem with that is those 5 factors are completely like unfavorable to the plaintiffs. There's many problems. One, they're untethered from the text, right? Coming from the text.
Yes.
But then they're also, it seems as if like the decision was made, right? And I will say, admittedly, there were progressives who did not want this case to go there. They had many reasons. Some thought this was not as bad as it was made out to be. Some thought that this was just a hostile Supreme Court to be bringing this case, what have you, right? So some people would have been very happy for this case not to have been brought. But the Supreme Court ruled very broadly here and then seemed to rule in a way that was eviscerating Section 2 even more with these guideposts that are totally friendly towards suppressive state laws. So that's where we are right now. I think it is more of a test than he wants to let on. He doesn't want to say it. There's nothing more a conservative hates than to create a multi-factor test and then call it that, right? No conservative likes that.
You have to
when you see that happen, and they're like really biting their something or other.
I forget which decision it was in which Justice Scalia said, it's got to be 20 years ago now. It was an administrative law case which was written with this opinion by Justice Alito in mind, foreshadowing it. And he said there is nothing, somebody should pull the actual language of this. It's really easy to search because of the way he spelled it. He said, that test most beloved by judges, I'm doing this from memory, so please forgive me, who don't want to be ruled by principle, viol, TH apostrophe OL apostrophe totality of the circumstances test. And that's exactly what Alito did here. And I want to rant for a moment about it because, you know, I'm not a lefty by any means.
Careful, Ben, you're going to sound like a crit.
No, I'm actually going to sound like a textualist, which I'm also not. But to me, this decision should have started with the text of the 15th Amendment, which reads in its entirety, "The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Now, critically, the second sentence of this sentence and section.
Oh, yes. Okay, you're right.
Reads in its entirety, "The Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation."
It's like really straightforward.
Now, these are not textually complicated sentences.
Nope.
Right?
Nope.
I mean, let's just be textualists for a minute. The 15th Amendment is a well-written document. It has two sentences. One says, no states can abridge, not deny, it's deny or abridge, lessen your right to vote on account of race or previous condition of servitude. We don't have any former slaves anymore. To leave out the second part of that, we do have race still in the country. These are not contestable propositions. They're not ideologically attackable propositions. The text of the Constitution actually says that no state's allowed to do certain things. The second sentence of the 15th Amendment says Congress has the power to set rules to enforce this broad principle. That is what the 1982 Voting Rights Act amendments were about. It is an exercise of the affirmative delegated power of the 15th Amendment to ensure that people have the right to vote irrespective of, say, race. On the question of, again, I don't think I'm departing from textualism here. On the question of the meaning and scope of the 15th Amendment, the proper textualist response, given the text of the 15th Amendment, is deference to Congress. That's what this case should be about.
Yeah.
The 15th Amendment says Congress gets to do things to enforce the principle. Congress is entitled to a certain degree of deference in doing it, not a retroactive set of. By the way, the complaint that this is federalizing elections is a great argument against the 15th Amendment. Like, if we were in a ratification debate about the 15th Amendment and the role of race in the 15th Amendment, okay. Like, I would support ratification of the 15th Amendment, but that's a legitimate argument against ratifying the 15th Amendment, I suppose. It's not a legitimate point given the 15th Amendment. And
Correct.
we've made, even Justice Kagan makes complicated what is actually very simple. There's two sentences in the Constitution that answer this question, and it answers it completely. And we don't even pay attention to them anymore since at least the Section 2 case.
Yeah.
I think the level of outrage just about people who purport to be textualists doing this stuff is woefully insufficient given the clarity of the text. That's all. That's my rant.
So can I agree with you on most of this? Yes, the 15th Amendment is an excellent addition to the Constitution. It was in 1870 when they added it to vindicate the rights of African Americans, and it's a everlasting proposition that is great. It includes people of all races. We should have a multicultural democracy, and that's a great proposition to stick in our Constitution. Sure, if you think this is federalizing the elections, you should have argued this in 1870, and in fact, a lot of people did. So that lost. It was a valid point, but it was a point that the framers of the 15th Amendment and the Congress and the state legislators that were ratifying it, that they all said, well, so be it. So those are all great things. It's such a great proposition, and it's so well written that other constitutional amendments have been modeled off of it. The 19th Amendment, which enfranchised women nationally, that is written almost verbatim with in the same language as the 15th Amendment, except they substitute the word sex. The 24th Amendment, which makes it illegal to enforce poll taxes, written very similarly. 26th Amendment, which makes it illegal to discriminate against 18-year-olds in voting, pretty much written the same, except for just substitute age instead of for race. So very clear. The couple points I want to depart with you a little bit are that in 1980, the Supreme Court read the 15th Amendment and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act as coterminous, right? So they said when Congress was writing Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, they really were just reiterating what was in the 15th Amendment. Well, I'm not sure who takes their time to do that. So what Congress did in the 1982 amendments was to say, okay, we didn't mean that this was coextensive with the 15th Amendment. What we meant is that anything that results, right? And this is where we get this whole sort of focus on the results test, because the Supreme Court said the 15th Amendment is about anything that is intentional discrimination, but results is a whole different story. Well, Congress said, well, the 15th Amendment, because you're the Supreme Court, may have to mean that now because you get the last word on it because you're the Supreme Court. But the Voting Rights Act in Section 2 does not mean that. The Voting Rights Act in Section 2, it's written like that, and we're going to amend it a little bit more to say that anything that results in a denial or abridgment of the right to vote and sort of these other words about equal opportunity and open participation and the like, right? So that's where it diverges, and then case law has sort of gone there. And so I will
hang
say
on.
that.
Can I stop you there? Because I think you're being way too generous here. There are other affirmative grants of authority to Congress in the Constitution, like the Commerce Clause. Right, and in the Commerce Power, we don't say, and by the way, these are articulated not just in civil rights cases, Heart of Atlanta Motel, but they're in frickin' Wickard v. Filburn about growing wheat.
I love that case.
I love Wickard. And by the way, what it says is when we say the commerce power, the power to regulate commerce, what we actually mean is the commerce power as amplified by the necessary and proper clause. And by the way, when we say regulate commerce, what we mean is anything whose downstream effects might cause a regulation of commerce, might implicate commerce. And so you can ban guns within 1,000 feet of a school as long as the gun moved in interstate commerce, right? You can do frickin' anything under the commerce power. That's how the Supreme Court normally interprets affirmative grants of power to Congress. Now, I'm not a super fan of the commerce jurisprudence. I actually think it's too broad in certain ways. But I do think the 15th Amendment, and for that matter, the 14th Amendment jurisprudence, should look something like other affirmative grants of authority to Congress. And
Right.
in any other area, you would say, hey, if Congress gives you the power, if the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate an area, we interpret that capaciously. We don't say Congress gives the Constitution gives Congress the authority to reiterate what's already in the Constitution. By the way, if that were necessary, you wouldn't need Section 2. It's already freaking there in Section 1. And then you have, to take it out of 15th Amendment land and put it in 14th Amendment land, you go to City of Burney, where they say, and by the way, we'll decide the substance of the amendment, and Section 2, and by the way, all of this is highly inflected by City of Burney, although they never mention that.
Right.
We'll decide the substance of the right, and then you don't have the right under Section 2 to do more than we say the right means, which means there's a question whether you could legislate abortion rights. There's a right, because we fucking decide what the substance of the right means. That's not what they do with commerce. It's not what they do with any of the articulated congressional authorities in Article 1, where they always say, read them capaciously on their own terms and amplify them with the necessary and proper clause.
Genevieve, do you mean the power to tax there?
And the power to tax is a great example. John Roberts is perfectly comfortable saying, I will uphold the entirety of Obamacare, except the parts that commandeer states.
Or vaginas.
I'm actually with him on the commandeering of state stuff. But I'll uphold all of Obamacare as an exercise of the power to tax. He doesn't say, what does tax mean to the people who ratified it? And by the way, the articulation of the authority is no broader than I say a tax means. Why do we tolerate this in the area of voting rights and civil rights?
I don't like to tolerate it. But I think the reason why we tolerate it is because we're afraid to do something about it, right? Or we try to do things about it, but we're not doing enough about it. Because, passing the Voting Rights Act itself was a massive coup for democracy, right? It was just so overdue at the time. Like, all of the things that were going on that led up to that, we did not enforce the letter of the Constitution for nearly a century, right? When we knew that people of color were supposed to be voting. They were not. So there was success there. And there was a period where that success flourished, right? We saw immediate results after 1965. We saw voting rolls swell, particularly in the South, where Black people were being disenfranchised. But the court thought something different. About a decade later, there was a takeover of the court. And frankly, even when we were into the 1980s and the rise of the New Right and the conservative movement, we had people on the scene like John Roberts, who has never liked the Voting Rights Act. He's never seen a pro-democracy measure that he thought was constitutional or legitimate or necessary or what have you. Frankly, even though John Roberts didn't write this opinion, he assigned the opinion, and this opinion did everything that John Roberts has been trying to do since the 1980s when he was a wee Department of Justice lawyer working against the Voting Rights Act amendments.
I say this as somebody who has a lot of sympathy with conservative jurisprudence in a lot of areas, and I am very fond of John Roberts, who's an old friend and somebody I care about. They're freaking out to lunch on this. It is impossible. I think the proper interpretation starting with the, if you just ask it as an original matter and say, by the way, there's a reason we called the people who passed this radical Republicans. They were actually really egalitarian. John Bingham was no joke. Much more, people hate the term radical Republican now because it implies that they somehow don't speak for our values or that they were radical. John Bingham was a radical. And we have written him out of constitutional history.
He's in my book.
Good.
I can't wait for, when's your book coming out, Will?
September 21st.
Nobody had a bigger impact on the Constitution that we live under than John Bingham. And he wrote the 14th Amendment, and he is largely unknown. He was a radical. He believed in radical egalitarianism, and to interpret those words in a narrow way involving the right to vote of the freedmen, which he cared about, you have to work to do that. And it is not a historically defensible position. And if you take textualism seriously, and I'm not a textualist, but I have a lot of respect for textualism, this will lead you to some radical places because the people who wrote these words were serious about what they were saying, and they actually thought about this shit, and they hated the southern state governments, and they wrote these laws, which are part of the Constitution, to effect a federal takeover of rights.
Right.
Now, male rights, not our modern conception of rights. But this was no joke radicalism. And, Alito is and Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett, they are kidding themselves if they think this is consistent with history.
Yeah. So this is really my biggest problem with this case and with Shelby County. It ignores history. It acts as if, one, history stopped at certain points, whether it stopped in 1965 or it stopped in 1982, that this case is basically saying, because we're going to measure the available modes for voting up against what was in existence in 1982. There's nowhere in the statute that says that. But then it ignores our actual history. We had 8 decades of struggle about slavery since the Constitution and the ratification of the Reconstruction Amendments. They were radical. They had this radical project that we could be a racially inclusive democracy. I mean, the idea of democracy in general was pretty radical, but when you start adding in Black people, former slaves, you had women at the time pressing for the vote. These were all radical ideas. And yet there was no complete takeover of elections, right? There were people, you can read all of these debates. There were people in the Congress who thought that, going completely radical and taking federalizing elections entirely sort of distorts the idea of federalism that we had in mind, right? It might impact other aspects of the Constitution that we're not thinking about. So there was some reluctance, but that's not to say what they were trying to do about making democracy available, accessible, and workable was not a radical project. It was. And we should go with that. And you were talking about John Bingham as the father of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is the most litigated part of our Constitution. That's it. Right? So, and it hasn't even been there for as long as the rest of the Constitution. So when we talk about equality, in all these measures, but in particular, and about the opportunities and access to democracy, we're talking about something that is really at the core of our Constitution. And so when you get sort of untethered or unmoored tests to sort of show you that voting is okay in America and there's not discrimination, or there's only a little discrimination when you compare it to some of the past, and that's acceptable to you, When you ignore the past that has happened, the cases that have preceded this, we ignore some of these facts. And the fact that these tie in to socioeconomic circumstances. To me, you are out to lunch. Your head is in the sand, and there are other people who suffer because of it.
And if you think the fact that it ties into socioeconomic circumstances is a mitigating factor rather than an exacerbating factor, it does raise questions about. I mean, that is a very hard position to not find infuriating.
Agreed, especially as someone who reads a lot of election law cases.
I have raptured into people, but they have accepted and are connecting, but are not able to connect, but they're not showing up. So we're gonna wrap. But I wanted to say, well, I've been leaving it with the last couple of episodes on a question with a guest that is going to poise them for coming on again. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about everything that's been going on about critical race theory and how this ties in to the Voting Rights Act. I know you and I have talked about critical race theory extensively, especially as a teaching tool and how valuable it is. I'm just kind of curious what you think about kind of this gross manipulation of like kind of this academic concept and philosophy that is like, I think about a little bit about what we're talking about right now, about being true to history and about being accurate in the history and how we reflect things going forward.
I mean, this whole discussion about critical race theory has bothered me in a number of ways. One, because I think critical race theory has become a stand-in for anything talking about where there's a problem that's related to race. And that may fit into it somehow, but that is not what we're talking about. We're talking about critical race theory. So it's kind of become a stand-in, and in particular corners, it's become a boogeyman for any discussion that might make someone feel bad about their ancestors' role in history or what have you. It bothers me that it's now become a reason for conservatives who are for open discourse, allegedly, to want to stifle discussion because it makes them uneasy or what have you, have to have conversations that they don't want to engage in, which is like their right to not engage in them. And it bothers me for what you just said, because it does ignore history. Critical race theory is not something that is mainstream. It is not in every elementary textbook. It's in no elementary textbooks, as far as I know, or high school textbooks. It is something that is really in legal academia, maybe some areas of sociology, and it has now just become something else. So I'm bothered by it because it's not getting its fair representation. It doesn't have enough defenders out there to say what it is, and so it can't fight on its own merits. But in general, I think the way that this case does fit into that whole discussion is that it also sort of seems to turn its head at the ways that race are interlaced in our systems, including our systems regarding democracy and voting and the way self-governance generally. But I have to think about that more, so maybe I will have to come back.
We would love that. Wilfred Codrington. I'm never going to get used to calling you Wilfred.
You can call me
You're
great, as Ben would say. Ben, just say it.
You're a great American. Come back soon. And we will be back tomorrow at an unusual time.
Oh, yeah.
Reminder that we are live at 3 p.m. tomorrow, not 5 p.m., because our guest is not on this continent and asked for time zone reasons. Again, query the necessity of time zones. Asked for time zone reasons for an earlier showing. That will be at Pwn All the Things. Matt Tate knows more about cybersecurity than the next 3 or 4 people combined that you might think of listening to an hour with. He is a genuinely unusual mind, and I say this as a self-taught non-lawyer lawyer, one of the best self-taught non-lawyer lawyers I have ever met. Jack Goldsmith once said of him that that the amount that he knows about law vies for the amount that he knows about cybersecurity. And he used to be a hacker for GCHQ, which is the British version of NSA. Matt is a genuinely fun character and knows is really worth your time. So that'll be
20 hours.
20 hours and 54 minutes from now.
And until then, look on Twitter for details about Friday Cheese Night, where I'll be meeting up in Manhattan and hanging out. Don't make that face, Will.
I'm lactose intolerant.
I know you are. I know that's why you made the face. And
Lactose-free cheese?
Yeah, we could use some lactose-free cheese. Yeah, that's the right face. Anyways, we don't have fun anymore, but we are allowed to finally hang out in a beer garden together and sweat our faces off. We're going to go into the air conditioning. Will, I love you. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
It's great being with y'all.